The Crusades. Between 1095 and 1291, a series of religious military campaigns launched from Western Europe changed the relationship between Christianity and Islam in ways that still echo today. It began with a speech. Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in France and called on Christian knights to march east and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. What followed was nearly 2 centuries of war, shifting alliances, and enormous human suffering on all sides. The First Crusade actually succeeded. Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099, and the scenes that followed were brutal, even by the standards of the time. Thousands were killed in the streets. Christian kingdoms were established across the Levant, and for a moment, it seemed like the mission had worked. But holding that land was a different challenge entirely. Successive crusades were launched to defend or recapture territory as Muslim forces, eventually united under leaders like Saladin, pushed back steadily. Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187 with a discipline that stood in sharp contrast to the original conquest. The Crusaders never regained it permanently. By 1291, the last major Crusader stronghold at Acre fell, and the era was over. The deeper consequences went far beyond land. Trade between East and West had actually grown during this period, bringing goods, ideas, and knowledge back into Europe. But the religious division deepened, and the memory of those wars embedded itself into both Christian and Islamic cultures in ways that no peace treaty could erase. The 30 Years' War. From 1618 to 1648, a conflict that began as a religious dispute in a single region of Central Europe grew into something that nearly broke the entire continent. The spark came in Prague, when Protestant nobles threw 2 Catholic royal officials out of a window in an act of defiance that became known as the Defenestration of Prague. It sounds almost absurd, but what followed was anything but. The Holy Roman Empire, which covered much of modern-day Germany and Austria, became the main battlefield. Catholics and Protestants had been building toward this for decades, ever since the Reformation split Western Christianity apart. What started as a religious war gradually attracted kings and kingdoms with far more political motivations. Sweden, France, Spain, and Denmark all entered the conflict at different points, often fighting for power and territory as much as for faith. The result was 30 years of armies moving through the same lands, burning villages, consuming crops, and spreading disease. Some parts of Central Europe lost a third or even half of their entire population. Entire towns simply ceased to exist. When the exhausted parties finally negotiated the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, they did more than end a war. They laid down principles that would govern international relations for centuries. The sovereignty of individual states was formally recognized. The idea that one ruler could not dictate the religion or internal affairs of another took hold. It was, in a quiet but profound way, the beginning of the modern world order. The Napoleonic Wars. At the start of the 19th century, a single man from a small island off the coast of Italy came closer to uniting Europe under one flag than almost anyone before or since. Napoleon Bonaparte had risen through the chaos of the French Revolution to become Emperor of France, and his ambitions did not stop there. Between 1803 and 1815, he led his armies across the continent in a series of campaigns that redrew borders, toppled monarchies, and terrified the established powers of Europe. His military genius was real. He moved armies faster than his enemies expected, used terrain cleverly, and understood the psychological dimension of battle as well as the tactical one. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain all suffered defeats at his hands at various points. At his peak, Napoleon's influence stretched from Spain to the borders of Russia. But power on that scale carries its own dangers. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was the turning point. His Grande Armée marched deep into Russian territory, reached Moscow, and found it abandoned and burning. With no decisive victory and a brutal winter closing in, the retreat became a catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died not from battle, but from cold, starvation, and exhaustion. The coalition against him strengthened, and by 1815 it was over. Napoleon was exiled to a remote island in the South Atlantic. What he left behind, however, was a Europe transformed. Nationalism had spread like fire across territories his armies had marched through. Old feudal structures had cracked. The Congress of Vienna tried to restore the old order, but nothing was quite the same again. The First World War. In the summer of 1914, a Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in the streets of Sarajevo. That single act set off a chain of events that nobody fully controlled and almost nobody wanted to stop in time. Within weeks, a web of alliances had pulled the major powers of Europe into war. What the generals on all sides expected to be a short, decisive conflict turned into 4 years of grinding, industrial-scale slaughter. The Western Front became a network of trenches stretching hundreds of miles where soldiers lived in mud and died for advances measured in yards. New weapons arrived that the world had never seen used at this scale: poison gas, machine guns, artillery barrages that lasted for days. The Battle of the Somme alone killed or wounded over 1 million men. Away from Europe, the war pulled in colonial forces from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, making it truly global in reach. By the time it ended in November 1918, 4 empires had collapsed entirely. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires all fell, and the map of the world was redrawn by exhausted men in Paris conference rooms. The Middle East was divided along lines drawn largely for European convenience, borders that planted tensions still unresolved today. The peace was called a settlement, but it was really a postponement. The Second World War. 21 years after the supposed war to end all wars, the world found itself in an even larger one. The conditions had never really been resolved. Germany had been left humiliated and economically devastated by the Treaty of Versailles. Into that despair came Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, with promises of restoration and a political ideology built on hatred and racial superiority. By 1939, German forces had invaded Poland, and the conflict that followed would become the deadliest in human history. It spread across Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and East Asia simultaneously. The numbers involved were almost impossible to absorb. An estimated 70 to 80 million people died, the majority of them civilians. The Holocaust was the deliberate, systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and Soviet civilians. It was not a side effect of war, it was a policy, carried out with bureaucratic precision. The war ended in stages. Germany surrendered in May 1945 following the fall of Berlin. Japan surrendered in August after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, introducing a new and terrifying dimension to what warfare could mean. The world that emerged from the rubble was fundamentally different. 2 superpowers stood where many had stood before. The United Nations was founded, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written, and the shadow of the atomic bomb hung over everything that came next: the Cold War. It was a war fought almost entirely without direct battle between its 2 main participants, and yet it shaped the second half of the 20th century more completely than any open conflict could have. From roughly 1947 to 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union faced each other in a state of permanent tension, each representing not just a nation, but a competing vision of how human societies should be organized. On one side, liberal democracy and capitalism. On the other, communist central planning and collective ideology. Both possessed nuclear weapons in quantities capable of ending civilization, and both knew it. That knowledge kept them from ever firing directly at each other, but it did not stop them from fighting everywhere else. Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, Cuba, Nicaragua, and dozens of other places became arenas where the 2 superpowers backed opposing sides, supplied weapons, trained fighters, and pursued their rivalry through other people's wars. At home, both societies were shaped by the fear the Cold War produced. In America, McCarthyism destroyed careers on suspicion of communist sympathy. In the Soviet Union, dissent could mean imprisonment or worse. The space race, the arms race, the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world closer to nuclear war than most people realized at the time, all of it was part of the same long standoff. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, it did not fall to an army. It fell to its own internal contradictions, economic failure, and the desires of its own people. The world it left behind was unrecognizable compared to the one the Cold War had begun in.